February 10th, 1675. It was the dreadful hour I'd heard of, but now mine eyes see it. The house on fire over our heads, we must go out, and Indians gaping there with their guns, hatchets, and swords to devour us. The bullets flying thick, one went through my side, and another through the bowels and hand of my dear child in my arms. Oh, the woeful sight of Christians wallowing in their own blood. This is a quote of a diary written by Mary Rowlandson, who was a captive during the King Philip War. Our sympathies go out to her and all victims of war. But were the English really the victims? Not to belittle the losses of my ancestors and yours, let's take a look at what happened to the native people. Why did they become so brutal in all accounts by English writers, yet before this war, they were not a warring people? Let's examine the King Philip War, which raged for 15 months in 1675 and 6. One in battle was within earshot of where we're sitting today. Why is it of interest? Is this a major war? Before the European contact, there were 2 million native people in New England. 60 years later, it was estimated by colonial writers there were only 20,000, although there were probably many in the woods who avoided all contact with the English. In that same time, the colonist population had gone from 0 to 50,000. The combined casualties were the highest of fatalities in any war in Northern America, in proportion to the population at the time. It changed the demography of New England forever, and it opened the doors for Europeans to settle the New World. It set a precedent of Europeans, settlers subjugating natives across the country and getting away with it. It inspired native people to stand up to the settlers when they came. Why haven't we heard much about the King Philip War? Because little was written by the native people who suffered the most. And history is recorded by the descendants of those English settlers, people like us. And we cannot be proud of their behavior during this time. Before the Pilgrims arrived, the native people were made a gift of blankets by the early explorers from the European continent. These blankets were infested with the plague, and the Europeans knew it. Many Indian people along the coast of New England perished in hordes in result of this gift and the visit of these European settlers. One such people were the people of Pawcasset, who lived around Plymouth, Massachusetts. Pawtuxet. After the plague hit in 1614 to 16, there were skeletons strewn across the ground. No native people wanted to move back there to settle. When the Pilgrims arrived, the native people were tempted by the guns and knives that the English had, and the sparkly trinkets. Human curiosity drove them to want to have these tools that would make their life easier. Also, the natives were basically a kind people. They felt badly because they had been watching the Pilgrims through the winter, seeing them suffer so in that first hard winter that the Pilgrims had been in Plymouth. And at the time, they were paying a tribute to the Narragansett people who lived all over New England. All the sub-tribes of the Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts areas paid a tribute to the Narragansett. And the leader of the people that lived around Plymouth was Usamequin. He's often known in these parts as Massasoit, but Massasoit is translated as a great man, and his real name was Usamequin, which is translated as Yellow Feather. He was the king or sachem of the Wampanoag people, and he wanted to stop paying this tribute. On the other hand, the settlers had quite a different outlook. They had struggled in England and Holland, and now were determined to have their settlement and have a strong foothold. Most of them were traders, and they were aggressive people. One settler, George Ellis, once said, "The Pilgrim is not of a character, either individually or collectively, with whom men of any other race could be expected to maintain harmonious relations." The Pilgrims felt they had been blessed by God. They had successfully come across the Atlantic, and they had found Plymouth, which was denuded of trees by the Patuxet people and was ready for cultivation. They also felt somewhat vulnerable because storms had blown them off the course while they were crossing, and over half their number had died in that first winter. So when Usamequin greeted them that day, March 22nd, 1621, both sides were very happy to make a friendship. Both leaders of both sides signed a treaty. This was the original example of English writing down promises that the native people didn't really understand. The aspect of that treaty that was most under concern, it came up to question the most times, was if any of his, meaning Usamequin's people, hurt any of ours, he should send the offender that we might punish him. The native people understood this would be a reciprocal treaty, and as you'll see over time, it wasn't exactly reciprocated by the English people. The first example of the conflict that led to the war happened only 2 years after the Pilgrims arrived. Squanto was a Patuxet man who had been kidnapped by the early English settlers and had been to Europe. He had learned English. So Usamequin made a gift of Squanto to the Pilgrims to be a guide and a teacher to tell them how. Squanto, wanting more power among the English, wanted to diminish Usamequin's esteem in their eyes and reported to the English that Usamequin was going to attack them. Usamequin sent his own personal knife with several of his men to Plymouth and requested that his men come back with Squanto's head and hands. But as the men arrived in Plymouth, a ship sailed into Plymouth Harbor, and the English leaders, the Pilgrims' leaders, said, "We can't give you Squanto right now. We might need him to translate. This could be an enemy boat." And so the Usamequin's men left in anger. So Usamequin thought, well, maybe I wasn't right in making this friendship, but he also still wanted to get out from under this, the tribute that he was paying. And 2 years later, he became very sick, and word reached Plymouth. So the governor at the time, Bradford, sent Edward Winslow to Usamequin's summer camp, where he was at the time, which is in Narragansett Bay on Mount Hope Bay, where Bristol is right now, Bristol, Rhode Island is now. Edward Winslow administered a simple English cure which showed a drastic recovery for Usamequin. Usamequin felt this was part of the magic of the English people, and he vowed loyalty to their cause for the rest of his life. In 1637, some more events happened that led to the King Philip War. There was a small disagreement between the Pequot people in Connecticut and the Connecticut settlers, the Pequot native people, and it had to do with a tribute, again, that was being paid. So the Connecticut settlers rose up and slaughtered almost all the Pequot people. This was horrifying, of course, to the natives, and yet they still revered the English people and felt they had a great deal of power. At the same time, in 1637, there was a smallpox epidemic among the native people, which weakened them further. And that same year, Roger Williams was banished from Salem for standing up for the natives in land dealings. And he was on his way down to Rhode Island to find sanctuary. He came across Usamequin, and he wintered with him. They became very friendly, which was probably not very encouraging to the English leaders. So in 1643, Rhode Island, Plymouth, and Connecticut formed the United Colonies. They felt there was strength in numbers, and yet there was a lot of dissension among those three colonies as to how to go about protecting themselves. In 1646, and you can follow some of these events on the timeline here, In 1646, Passaconaway, who was the sachem or king of the Pennacook people in southern New Hampshire, his son was kidnapped by the English people. They put a noose around his neck and led him out of the camp. And later, Passaconaway's son escaped, came back, but was kidnapped again. This is the first real outward conflict that occurred after the Pequot War. During this time, there was positive trade between the two people. The Indians had plenty of beaver pelts, furs. There was a lot of demand for them because of what people wanted to wear in London. The Indians were making wampum, which is small shells that they made from quahog shells, and that was used as money. So they would decorate their clothes with this and trade to the English people for what they wanted, which was knives and pots and guns. However, at this point, had been already one ruling by the colonies a little bit earlier saying that they shouldn't sell guns to the English. But still, there was some trade with involving guns because they were in such high demand. During this time also, 1630 to 1655, there were many laws passed against the traditional behavior of the natives. They couldn't grease their bodies, which they did to keep warm in the winter and keep mosquitoes off them in the summer. They couldn't have several wives. They couldn't work, shoot guns, or travel on the Sabbath. And later, in 1646, they couldn't hunt or fish on the Sabbath. These were many reasons that the English could find the native people and get more beaver pelts and furs and wampum from them. However, in 1649, just about right between when the English settled and the beginning of the King Philip War, things started to change. The London fashions changed, so they didn't want furs or beaver pelts anymore. Also, beaver were just about extinct because they had been overhunted. The English started minting coins in Boston, so wampum wasn't in demand anymore. A lot of the native people had actually changed their their migration routes to stay at the ocean a lot longer to make the wampum earlier. So it had changed. They had changed their life, and now they had to be selling whatever they had to get the coins that were being minted. And all they had that the English wanted was land. There were a great many English flooding into the New World at this time. There was a lot of people were writing letters home, and a great deal published about the New World. In 1652, there was a proclamation to try to amend the land sales practices. The Massachusetts authorities had to recognize every deed that was passed. Each sachem, the king of the area where the land was sold, had to sign the deed. The English could retain hunting rights, whereas before the natives would sell the land and think they could maintain hunting rights, and the English felt that the land was theirs to settle, so there was a great discrepancy in that way. And in 1652 also, it was banned for them the natives to buy horses and to sell land. They had to sell land only to Plymouth. This caused a great deal of strain in the relations, as you might imagine. There was also a group that was growing at this time. It was called the Praying Indians. More and more native people were enticed by Christianity. They felt that since the English had these guns, had the sparkly trinkets, and they had a more powerful God. So there was a large movement, and many of them centered in different towns around Massachusetts, Natick being the original town of Praying Indians. John Eliot had translated the Bible into Algonquian in order to lure more Indians in. And the English people really believed that their religion was superior, and it was their mission in the New World to correct the savages and to tell them the right way to believe. During this time, Usamequin maintained the peace in spite of the lack of good treatment of the native people. He liked the English people, and he had many personal friends among them. He also saw the value in the friendship. As his health declined in the early 1660s, he asked his two sons to take on English names to show that they, too, would follow the loyalty of friendship, in the friendship he had created with the English. His oldest son was named Wamsutta, and he was renamed Alexander by the English. And the two sons took on these names willingly. It was part of the native practice to change your name as you went through different phases of your life. And these two sons were in their 20s at the time. And the younger son was Metacom, or Po Metacomet, and he was given the name Philip. Alexander was named after Alexander the Great, and Philip was Alexander the Great's father. This young man, Philip, was the future King Philip. Usamequin died in 1662. So King Alexander took on the problems and the joys of being the leader. He was called to question by Josiah Winslow, who was the son of Ed Winslow, the old friend of Usamequin's. Josiah was one of the leaders among the Pilgrims at this time, because the people in Plymouth, the leaders in Plymouth, questioned whether Alexander really was going to be loyal to the English. So Alexander was asked to come to court, but he was busy making canoes. As one knows in a subsistence culture, one needs to take advantage of the seasons and whatever activity has to be done for that season to prepare for the next. And he was making canoes in Munponset, right about here. So Josiah marched with several of his men and found Alexander at the place where he was making canoes and put a gun to his head and said if he didn't march, he was dead. Alexander was greatly upset by this because here his father had been such good friends with Josiah's father, and he was being treated like a slave, a criminal, in front of his people. They marched him that day and his other men to Duxbury, where Winslow's house was, and they stayed overnight there, and they were on their way to Plymouth. That night, Alexander was fed some bad shellfish, and he became violently ill. That night, Josiah allowed all the native people that were there to carry Alexander back to their home in Montauk, it's called, in Bristol, Rhode Island. And there, Alexander died shortly thereafter. This brought King Philip to power, but he was not a happy man at this point. He had a lot of bad feelings toward the English, and his older brother had tried to overlook them, his father had overlooked them, and he was of a different nature. He was tactful, but he wasn't about to let all of these atrocities go. In 1671, that was 6 years later, he was asked to come to question. He was asked to come to question in Taunton, and at that meeting, he was asked to give up all his guns. But he wasn't about to give in to the English. He gave up the guns only of the natives that were following him that he knew would probably become praying Indians, so they weren't going to be his loyal followers anyway. So he only gave up those few, and 6 months later he was called back and they asked, why haven't you given up your guns? And he said, I have some grievances I need to tell you, and you need to listen. And all the English leaders were saying, no, we can't hear this, we don't have time for this. But John Easton, after whom the town of Easton is named, stood up for King Philip, and he said, we have to listen to this man's grievances. We're living in the same place with them, and we have to show him that respect. So it was said afterwards, after King Philip mentioned all of these aspects that he felt had been unfair of the English behavior, Easton suggested there be a fair table discussion, taking the magistrate from New York, who was nonpartisan, and a sachem, a king from another tribe that would be nonpartisan, and talk about these differences. King Philip was very interested in this. He would have gladly have met and tried to overcome the differences in that way. But this meeting never happened. In 1675, a praying Indian who had been at Natick, but he was now among the English King Philip's camp, working as King Philip's secretary and translator. His name was Sassamon. And he had written in the will that he had written for King Philip, he had included a lot of land for himself. So he wasn't exactly an upstanding follower of King Philip. And he decided he wanted to go back to Natick and endear himself to the English. So he went back to Plymouth and told Josiah Winslow that King Philip was planning war. And it probably was true at this point. However, King Philip was very careful, and he wanted to make sure he had enough food and ammunition and guns before war broke out. On the way back from his meeting, Sassaman's meeting with Winslow, Sassaman was murdered. And of course, the English magistrates said, of course, it was King Philip that ordered this death. And they couldn't convict King Philip being a sachem, but they did convict King Philip's 3 councilmen of the murder. And there was a trial with predominantly English on the jury and a couple of native people. And when it came to trial 5 months later, King Philip pointed out that the man they are using as an eyewitness owed a great deal of money from a gambling debt to the 3 councilmen. But Josiah Winslow stood up and said, well, why, when the 3 councilmen walked by the dead body of John Sassaman, why did it start bleeding again? In English belief system, they felt that if the dead body started bleeding, the guilty party was present. And so, most of the jury being English, the 3 councilmen were hanged. This didn't improve their relations or King Philip's feelings toward the English. I'd like to show you a few pictures of what life was like at this time before the outbreak of the war. This is called a weetu. The small building is a summer weetu where the families would spread out a little bit more with their own families. It was a matriarchal society. The family would center around the mother. And the longer weetu is what they lived in the winter, where several families would come together and work together to survive the hard winter. Okay, next. This is the inside of a weetu that's built in the Haffenreffer Museum, which is in Bristol, Rhode Island, on the traditional spot of Oosamiquin and King Philip's summer home. This is my son at 2 years old, enjoying the atmosphere, and he's now almost 5.
What's the material?
Bark. Bark covers the weetu. No, next. No, we've already seen that. And it said that there used to be an Indian grinding stone about a day's journey apart throughout New England at this time. So the native people could carry their own corn kernels with them and grind them to make a fresh meal each night. This Indian grinding stone is right on Green Hill Road here in Sudbury, right next to where Singletary intersects. They used to use wampum not only for money, but also to decorate their clothing. And the sachem of each tribe would have a belt that would go around their shoulders for ceremonial occasions. And this is a picture of what they think is one of the sachem's belts of New England at that time, and this is in storage at the Peabody Museum at Harvard. And this is the Sudbury bow. The bow on the left side of the picture is called the Sudbury bow, and this is also at the Peabody Museum. And it is said that that is the model for the bow that's in the hand of the native man, the Indian man, on the Massachusetts flag. We should get that back for our archives. This is a picture I took on one of my visits to the Haffenreffer Museum. This is a picture of Montauk, that place in Mount Hope Bay, near Narragansett Bay, where Oosamiquin and King Philip had their summer home. And right next to the Haffenreffer Museum is a cliff and a clearing where there's a seat hollowed out, modeled by my lovely daughter here, where King Philip supposedly sat and held council. Thank you. Now, King Philip went back to Montauk, and he really was trying to be tactful at this point, except the fact that two English settlers were caught by two of his men in the woods, and they were brought back to King Philip, and King Philip let them go. And his warriors were very upset about this because the English had definitely not been treating them well. And King Philip said, okay, you guys can go to Swansea, which is the nearest English town to where their summer place is. It's right here. And you can kill some of the livestock there to teach the English a lesson. Well, it was a day of fasting for the English. The English felt the reason they were having problems with the Indians was that they weren't being reverent enough. You know, compared to the original pilgrims who had arrived in 1620, by 1670 the people weren't quite as God-fearing, shall we say, as they had been, and there was a resurgence of religion during this time. And so there was a day of fasting. Everybody had to be in church all day, and so the warriors said, it'll be easy. We'll just go knock off a few livestock, and then we'll be out of there. So King Philip said, okay, that's okay. So they went there, but an old man had not gone to church, and his grandson was with him at his home. And as the warriors killed a few livestock, the young boy had a gun right there, and he aimed at the natives and shot, and it hurt one of the native people, drawing blood. It was a belief among the natives that the person that drew the first blood would lose the war. So that's the reason another reason the natives weren't going to initiate the war. But now, since the native had been harmed, it was okay to shoot back. And the English came out of the church where they had heard the gunfire, and 9 English were killed. Right after that, English troops pursued King Philip down the peninsula. They figured they could just capture him and kill him, and that would be the end of it. But King Philip escaped by canoe across the Mount Hope Bay to where Weetamoo was. She was the widow of his brother Alexander, and a staunch supporter of retaliating to the English. There was no love lost in her mind toward the English. She was a Narragansett woman, and once King Philip got there and explained what had happened, she said, well, your women, children, and elders all need to go to a place to be protected while you wage war. And she said that down in the Narragansett fort in Kingston, Rhode Island, what's Kingston, Rhode Island now, is a good place. It's in a swamp. No English people be able to cross the swamp, and they'd be very safe there. They have corn stores, and they could stay there, wait out the war. And so all Metacom's, King Philip's, women and children and elders went on down to there and were welcomed by the Narragansett people. I use the word Metacom because in my film writing, I use the word Metacom. I think it's more respectful to the native people. So if I slip into Metacom, just know that that's King Philip. King Philip also went to find out if he could get help from Awashonks, who was the queen, another Narragansett queen down at Sakonnet Point. But she was torn. King Philip was her cousin, and yet an Englishman had bought land from her 3 years before, and she had become quite friendly with him and trusted his judgment. His name was Benjamin Church, and he prevailed on her not to join King Philip. However, she eventually did join King Philip's forces and lent a hand for him for most of the war. He also went to Passaconaway in southern New Hampshire, up here, the one who I told you already had some negative contact with the English, thinking he could get help from Passaconaway. But at this point, Passaconaway he responded to King Philip in saying, I am an old oak, my limbs totter, soon I must fall. I, who can take a rattlesnake in my palm, as I would a worm, without harm. I am powerless against the palefaces. Peace with them is the last wish of Passaconaway. So Passaconaway felt that the only way to resolve this conflict of the relations was to give in to the English. And Metacom, King Philip, was very strong in his vision, seeing that if they gave in, they would be killed. If they stood up to them, the English, maybe they would be able to fight them off and fight them back into the sea and have their land again. Right at the beginning of the war, there was another person who came into the forefront. He was a Sudbury native, Ephraim Curtis. He had been raised here and was a close childhood friend for a Nipmuc boy that lived on Knobscot Mountain. And he knew how to speak Nipmuc, so he was asked by Governor Leverett of Massachusetts to get a promise of peace from the Nipmuc sachems, because the authorities in Boston were very nervous that the Nipmuc, who covered all of the central Massachusetts area, a huge number of people, would join King Philip in the war. So Curtis took 5 men, English men, to where he knew the Nipmuc were meeting. And they were on an island in a swamp, and Ephraim Curtis arrived over a piece of swamp a little distant away. And Curtis yelled over, "Please send your leaders over. I want to talk to you and talk peace with you." He talked in Nipmuc. And they answered back, "No, you come over here." Well, the 5 English men that were with him were horrified. They felt they were walking into a death trap. And the Nipmuc sachem said, "Just leave your horses and guns there and come across." And so the Nipmuc dropped their guns, and Ephraim Curtis dropped his guns, and they made their way across the swamp, and Ephraim Curtis got a promise of peace from them, and none of the English were harmed. However, 2 weeks later, Ephraim Curtis was leading some other English men to get another promise of peace, and he recognized that one of the traps still had a beaver in it, and he knew the native people never left food in traps, never wasted anything that they killed. And so he knew something was wrong, and he advised the English leaders to turn back. But the English leaders said, "No, we have to keep on going. We've got an order from the governor." And they were ambushed at Brookfield, which is right here. And almost all of them were killed. They took refuge in the garrison in Brookfield, which was a reinforced home that it was prepared for battle. The battle raged for 2 days, and they ran out of water, but Ephraim Curtis recognized that everybody would die if he didn't go and find help. He tried to escape twice, and the 3rd time he was successful. And he ran all the way to Marlborough, which from here, it's a long way. There's Marlborough right there, to get help. And the Marlborough people came and stood up for them, and the Indians left. At this time, the Praying Indians were considered a threat by most of the English authorities. People like Benjamin Church, who knew some of the Indians, thought, well, they are loyal people. They're loyal to whatever they say. They keep their promises. We really can use them as spies and as guides and get information on how to wage war against these people. But the top leaders, Josiah Winslow and John Everett in Massachusetts, didn't trust them at all. So every praying Indian that they could find, they put on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. They were not given any clothes, or shelter, or food. And these people died by hordes. Right about this time, now we're up to about December 1675, and the English were feeling that they really had to, they were getting reports that some of King Philip's people were down in the Narragansett fort. And so the English assembled 2,000 troops, although they were not very well prepared, and they went to Wickford, Rhode Island, and then they marched all the way to Kingston in a blizzard. And they surprised the swamp fort here and slaughtered almost all the women, children, and elders that were there. This was a huge blow to the native people, because they had these corn stores and they were planning to use those throughout the winter, and now the natives were on the run, feeding themselves hand to mouth in the cold New England winter. About this time, King Philip, he wasn't present at the Great Swamp Fight, it's called, in Kingston, Rhode Island. They say that he had sent word back to his people that he was sick, but he had I've also read that he secretly went up to Albany to meet with the French, because the French hated the English as much as he did, and he knew that they had guns and ammunition up there. So on his way back, he was successful in getting some guns. On his way back, he came through Mohawk country, and he thought, well, I'll try to get support from them. Mohawk were known as being a very warring people among natives. So he asked for support, And the Mohawks said, you know, kind of tottering back and forth, saying, well, come back in a few days, we'll tell you our decision. And King Philip, at this point, I think was losing some of his clear-minded rationale. He went and attacked an English town and took the clothes of the Englishmen that he killed and put them on himself and his warriors. And he went back and found a small camp of Nipmuc, a small sub-camp of the Nipmuc people, and attacked them wearing the English clothes. There was one Mohawk man that wasn't dead but played dead, and he saw through the fact that a button was missing on one of these English coats that there was war paint on dark skin underneath the English clothes. So this Mohawk knew it was actually King Philip that was slaughtering the Mohawk. And he was able to make his way back to the Mohawk camp and report what he knew. And the Mohawks started pursuing King Philip from the west, which didn't help matters much for King Philip. It happened just 2 months later. There was so little money available coming from England. It was a hugely expensive endeavor to have to wage war, and both sides were suffering greatly through the winter. The United Colony actually disbanded their army on February 4th, 1676. They had no money. The monarchy was back after having had Cromwell for a while, but there was a great deal of chaos in England still. And Winslow at this time retired as commander, although he stayed as he maintained his position as governor of Plymouth. On February 10th, as I started out with this talk, was the day that Mary Rowlandson was captured in Lancaster. Lancaster being here. She was the minister's wife, and she was considered a valuable commodity because a minister made pretty good money. And so the King Philip's people felt that it would be a good move to have leverage in bargaining with the English. She spent 2 months traveling with King Philip's people and wrote an extensive diary documenting that time. And it's wonderfully vivid, seeing some first-hand information, what it was like. But she showed many kindnesses by the native people, although it was a very rough life for all of them. And it was difficult for her to recognize that she was lucky that she wasn't being killed. She was ransomed on May 3rd, 1676, at the foot of Wachusett Mountain out here, for 20 pounds, the same cost as a house at the time. On April 18th, 1676, Marlborough was burned. Okay, this was King Philip's final push. He knew he had to, because of running out of resources, his people were sick, he had to be successful in pushing all the way to the ocean in order to fill his goal. And I'd like to show you a couple of pictures of this period. So he was recovering. Marlborough was just kind of recovering from being burned. The next day, he attacked Sudbury. But just to go back a little bit, this is the site of Mary Rowlandson's house. It's in Lancaster, and the Historical Society planted a tree there 100 years ago. And now it's kind of rotten, and it's tilting to one side, and we'll probably have to think of some other way to commemorate her. But it's in that field. Okay, next. On April 19th, 1676, King Philip attacked the Haines Garrison, which is on Water Row. And this is a picture of it looking out onto Sudbury River with a little bit of the foundation. And there's a sign there that says, "The site of Haines Garrison, home of Deacon John Haines. Here the settlers, by their brave defense, helped save the town when the Indians tried to destroy Sudbury." And this was erected in 1922. The fight at Haines Garrison, there were many aspects of a lot of these battles that made you think that God really did want the English to take over, because at this particular battle, the natives set fire to a barn to create a smoke shield so the natives could get closer to Haines Garrison. But just as they were approaching Haines Garrison, the wind changed, and the smoke blew the other way, leaving a bunch of natives really exposed, and that was, you know, they lost a lot of men right there. but it was pretty much of a draw. I also want to point out April 19th, 1676 was 100 years to the day before the start of the Revolution. Okay, next. And then King Philip took his troops back. He wasn't able to penetrate Haines' garrison. So he knew that Marlborough, more troops would be coming back from Marlborough because he had seen the troops pass him. Wadsworth from Duxbury had gone through the area, and they had hidden in the woods to let Wadsworth's troop pass. And so they were out in Marlborough while the fight at Haines' garrison was happening. But he knew they'd be back. So he waited in the woods, and he set up an ambush for Wadsworth's troops. And this is a picture of Green Hill. You can see a little bit of Route 20 off to the right of the hill. And this is a picture from Knobscott Mountain. So as soon as the troops got between Green Hill and Goodman's Hill, King Philip let a few of his men run up right between the two hills. And of course, Wadsworth saw the Indians running into the woods and thought, oh, there's King Philip's men, we're going to get them. So they ran up between the two hills, and as soon as they were right between the two hills, the Indians descended from all sides. Wadsworth men were able to hold off the natives, to hold off King Philip, until they were able to get to the top of Green Hill. And they kept on shooting because they had the advantage of gravity at this time, and until sunset. And King Philip said, I know if it's nighttime, the English are going to be able to escape, and this is like our last-ditch effort, and we've got to pull out all the stops. So he set fire to the top of Green Hill, and he flushed out the English people, the soldiers that were there. Next slide. This is what the top of Green Hill looks like now. This is Poconoket Avenue. It's thickly settled. Hardly a trace of such a dramatic battle. It's also a turning point battle because it was the last time that King Philip won a battle in the King Philip War. And from this point, he had to recede. He wasn't able to get any closer to Boston than this battle here. Next. So the men were flushed out of the top of Green Hill and ran down the hill toward Hopsbrook Mill, which is where the mill shopping center is now. Only 2 of them made it. The rest of them were killed. And the Wadsworth Memorial, the monument that's our town seal, is built on top of the remains of the men that lost their lives that day. During the battle on Green Hill, about 10 men from Concord tried to come over and reinforce the troops that were here. They had, at this time, it's interesting because communication was just starting, and the English were able to set up a system of flashing lights from hilltops, and they could flash messages from one hilltop to another. This is the first time they were able to communicate long distance. And the messages, the central point for the messages to be received or put out was actually Beacon Hill in Boston, and that's why Beacon Hill is called Beacon Hill. Anyway, the message had been received that this battle was going to happen, or was happening, and the people from Concord tried to cross this bridge, which is a 4-arch bridge off Route 27 right down here. It was built in the 1630s. It's probably the original way of getting across Sudbury River. And the Indians fought the Concord people back, and almost all of them were killed. And there's a stone right on the edge of the bridge commemorating their names. You can just keep that. Oh, no, I don't need that one yet. Just. So that was the Sudbury fight. At this point, Winslow really wanted to get King Philip. It was being too costly, and he finally relinquished and said, Benjamin Church, you can have whatever you want. You can have praying Indians, you can have, guns and food, and we'll just find the resources because we feel that you are the most likely one to be able to track King Philip down. So Benjamin Church was, just after he had been contracted by Winslow, was by canoe. He was crossing coming across here, and he had thought maybe King Philip would come back to his traditional home. But he was crossing the point where Awashonks was, where he, who had been his friend, because she was his neighbor. And she knew that she had joined King Philip. But as he canoed past these beaches, he saw warriors out there, and he recognized them as Awashonks warriors. And he yelled to them and was able to set up a meeting with Awashonks 2 days later. And he met with Awashonks, and the men that were with him were terribly afraid, because here the English side was meeting with the native side, and any time there had been on any other meetings, all the English had been shot down. But Church was able to, through his friendship with Awashonks, get to talk to her and persuade her to join the English side. And Awashonks was lent her son, her son, to go with Church to be his guide and to help track down King Philip. Church was able to also find out from his spies that King Philip was on his way back here, and he intercepted them in the Taunton River. He came across the King Philip's troops just as they were crossing the river, and he was able to shoot King Philip's uncle, who was Usamequin's brother, and had been a wonderful, strong support for King Philip through all these ups and downs and trials. And they captured King Philip's wife and 9-year-old son. Now, with native people, as with our own, family is nearest and dearest, and this just about broke King Philip's spirit. Now, it was going to be very hard, and the English knew it, for King Philip to maintain his viciousness as a warrior. So King Philip went on down. he was able to make his way back to just outside Montauk, and he was camping just outside where his traditional home was, hiding there at night. And he was, that night he just had a feeling that it was just about over for him. He pointed out to his chief warrior, Anawan, that the moon was in the crescent phase, and that was unfavorable in war because of the way the moon spills out. It can't hold anything. The moon spills out. And so Metacom, King Philip, gave the totems of leadership to his chief warrior, Anawan, and said, please, give this wampum belt that I have, and make sure it gets to my son and heir. And if by chance my son and heir, it doesn't survive, please take it yourself and find a new place for our people. As Philip slept that night, Benjamin Church was assembling his people and creating an ambush. Now, this shows how much the English had learned from the native people as far as warfare. Instead of just going in and shooting their guns, they planned the attack, and they used their knowledge of King Philip. The Indians that were with Benjamin Church told him that King Philip was always the first to flee, and he always went through the swamp because he knew the English were helpless in the swamp. So Benjamin Church placed his men in twos around the swamp that was in back of Metacom's King Philip's camp. And he instructed the rest of his men to approach from the front, and at the first light of dawn to attack the Metacom's camp, King Philip's camp, and drive them out of the camp, and the men around the swamp would make sure to shoot at anyone that was moving silently, because Church had told all his own men to make as much noise as they could while they were pursuing King Philip through the swamp. So the Church's men would know, just shoot the silent ones. So at dawn, it worked just about right on plan. A man fired into the camp. King Philip was up and out of there and had only his gun with him and was swimming across the swamp with all he could. And one pair spotted him, and the Englishman of the pair shot at King Philip, but his gun misfired. And the native man of the pair aimed at King Philip's heart, and 2 bullets found their mark. It's incredible to think that one of King Philip's own men would be the one to bring him down. I'd like the next slide. This is the spot where supposedly King Philip died. It is back in the woods of where the Hafenreffer Museum is near Montauk, and is not open to the public. I went to Haffenreffer Museum and heard that it was there and had to, get aggressive with the receptionist there for him to tell me where it was. And I was dragged my poor little son out there into the woods, and we found it. There's a stone there that says, "In Miry Swamp, 100 feet west-southwest from this spring, according to tradition, King Philip fell, August 12th, 1676. It's the only thing I have to say now is that King Philip's head was taken from his body. His body was quartered in this place because the English were so afraid if they left the body together, it would reconstruct life and come back to life and haunt them again. So they quartered his body, took his head, and he had a hand that was malformed. It had been hurt in an explosion of a gun when he was younger. Took his head in hand and took them to Plymouth. His head was put on a pole and stood on Plymouth Common for 20 years. Plymouth Common is in the shadow of Strawberry Hill, where his father, Usamequin, had greeted the pilgrims and given them gifts. I'd like to close with a prayer that's written by the ethno-historian of the Narragansett tribe and a very insightful woman, Ella Seketow. Great Spirit, Creator of all things, in humbleness we ask you to accept our thanks for all you have given us. We pray for peace and unity. As we meet on common ground, may our ears, eyes, and minds be open to understand, respect, and protect all things. See us, hear us. Thank you.